Okay, some of you know that back when I was in the Air Force, I did some blogging, and I actually had a few things appear on a website called The Sandbox, which was a website devoted to military bloggers, and it was created by Gary Trudeau, who also does the comic strip Doonesbury. And his effort was to provide a large forum for folks to write about their experiences in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And they did very little editing. It was pretty much left up to the individuals to write freely. And they also published a book with some of those writings, which we do have one copy out there on the shelf, and I had a few things in there. Now, this was many years ago, and it really wasn't even on my mind anymore. I'd stopped blogging and totally got rid of my blog. But I got an email one day from David Stanford, who was the editor, and he was a really great guy. Lots of communication with him when I was posting things there, just super friendly, and they always watched out for the folks who actually contributed. They would even give us some gifts occasionally. Got a signed print from Gary Trudeau of his comic strip that actually launched The Sandbox, which is one of my treasured possessions. And so I'm always excited to see something from him. And he wrote and said, "Well, Doug," and this is going out to everyone, but he individualized it. We are going to be shutting down the Sandbox soon in the near future. The second war is finally winding down. We're out of Iraq for the most part. And we're going out to all of our contributors and asking if they'd like to do one last one. A goodbye post, if you will. And what are your thoughts now after all these years? And so naturally, I said I'd be happy to contribute because that was such a big part of my life. And as I worked on it, I thought, you know, some of this would also make a good sermon. Originally, I thought maybe a good chunk of it, but actually, when all is said and done, very little of it survived. But I still wanted to talk about war, endless war, the war that permeates us as Americans in our society and how it touches us. And so throughout this talk today, you're going to hear some stories like this one. I was sitting down at Geeks one day playing Magic the Gathering, as I often do, and I was talking with a couple of the younger players, and one of them made a remark about how, you know, Doug, you are living the life. And I said, well, you know, all you got to do is go serve in the military 20 years, and then you get your pension, and it gives you, you know, income for just breathing. All I do is breathe, and I get a paycheck every month. And then a guy down the table, just a couple of, his name's David, he said, yeah, or you could survive an explosion, an IED, and get a metal plate in your head, and then you get paid every month also, disability pay. And that sort of, I looked at him, I said, gee, I'm sorry. He goes, no, don't be sorry. I wouldn't have done it any differently. Now, I don't know if it was because of his desire to serve or the fact that he survived and he also gets a pension now because he has a metal plate in his head, but his life has been touched unchangeably, irreversibly by his time at war. So what do I think about war? I get asked this a lot, you know, having served. What do I think about Afghanistan and Iraq? What do I think about our foreign policy? And you know, but when it really comes down to it, I always come back to the Taliban. As villains go, as enemies go, if you were going to write a movie script or write a novel or any form of fiction, and you wanted to create a villain, and you described them the way you described the Taliban, people would say, oh, get real. You got to have someone who's more realistic. This is just so comically, so over-the-top evil, no one would believe this. I mean, after all, they blow up schools for the crime of teaching little girls how to read and educating them. They kill their teachers. They blow up ancient statues of the Buddha. They have outlawed fun. They have banned kite flying, music, many forms of dress, forms of hats. They have thugs that walk the streets and beat women if they show their bare hand. And these are all stories I do not get via newspapers or articles. These are stories I heard from the people who lived there and lived through it. They are as true as anything is true in this world. I know this as much as I know anything, that this is what life was like under the Taliban. They actually took people and executed them at halftime of soccer games. One of my translators, my interpreters, lived through this as a high school student, having gone to a soccer game, and much to everyone's surprise, they trotted out people and shot them at halftime of a soccer game. Imagine doing that during the Super Bowl. So as villains go, you just go, wow, why would anyone want to live under these people? Why would anyone want to be these people? If they had the technology and the military capability of the Nazis, they, in my opinion, would have been far worse than the Nazis in the number of people they killed and tortured and maimed. And yet they still exist. In fact, they continue to recruit new members, which either says something about our foreign policy or humanity's willingness to submit to thugs or to become a thug. And after all the years that we spent in Afghanistan, we have not succeeded in reducing them to irrelevancy. And I'd be hard-pressed to call all of this worthwhile. Oh, we've done many good things there, you would think. We have helped to establish a government that now constitutionally allows women to be educated, that builds schools and roads and tries to create a functioning government and a functioning culture, but it doesn't seem to be going very well. Now, why is that? Maybe we've gone about it all wrong. Maybe war wasn't the answer. One example I like to use is that of our drone policy. Imagine, if you will, that your neighbor was a criminal of some sort, perhaps a meth dealer or some other form of drug dealer, or maybe they ran a fencing operation out of their house. Maybe they were even plotting to overthrow the government. And then imagine that the police had the capability of destroying that house with a drone launched from an airplane, not manned by a human, barely visible from the ground, and suddenly a Hellfire missile rains down, destroys that home, and the surrounding homes. And you come home one day to find that your home is gone, your loved one's dead, anything that meant anything to you, whether it be people, pets, goods, it's all gone in the name of a greater good of taking out that criminal via a remotely controlled drone launching a missile. How would you feel? How would you feel? Even if the government told you, but we killed this horrible criminal next door. We're terribly sorry that there was some collateral damage. Terribly sorry. But the criminal's gone. Isn't it worth it? These sorts of things happen throughout the world today by drones launched or controlled by us in the effort to do a greater good of taking out terrorists in countries we're not even at war with. And then we wonder why people hate us, because we have collateral damage. And so it becomes almost a math equation. How many innocent deaths equals a greater good? How many innocent deaths equate to more people who hate us and want to kill us? Civilians have always been targets in war. They've always been pawns. They've always been victims. In World War II, of course, we had the concept of total war, and we took on the policy of destroying civilian populations via bombing, knowing full well that civilians would die, whether it be conventional bombs or atomic bombs. That was our policy. We will win this war at any cost. And the civilian lives that are lost are part of the price we have to pay for a greater good. And it became a calculus of war. How many innocent people can we kill and still justify it in our minds because the greater evil would exist if we didn't do it? These are the foreign policy issues that we've dealt with throughout our history and deal with today. Just like my friend David with the metal plate in his head, there are many people who are touched by war. A hutmate of mine, Doug Templeton, who was also a poster on the Sandbox, just had his farewell post published last week. I want to share some of that with you because he's still active duty and he just got orders to go back to Afghanistan again. I cannot even imagine having to go back. I did not truly understand the toll my deployment took on my family until well after my return. My daughter was 13 when I left and was in that typical teenage phase of independence. Showing concern for her parents was not cool. She had grown up and no longer had those overt showings of affection. But several months after I got back, and this was back in 2007, we were driving home one evening in the car and she started to cry and tell me how afraid she had been and how it was still affecting her. It was a tough moment for me. I thought we had moved on and everything was back to normal. But clearly she had not been able to process the feelings she had experienced. But my wife is the one who probably hides her feelings the best. She always has a positive attitude. However, I know she had her moments too. During my last deployment, we lived in base housing right around the corner from the chaplain. And as you may or may not know, when a service member is lost, the commander, chaplain, and casualty assistance officer come to the door in person to give you the news. One afternoon, she looked out the window and saw the chaplain's car pull up right in front of the house and stopped. And she assumed the worst. She told me she just sat on the floor and cried. After a few moments, nobody knocked on the door, and she hesitantly looked back out the window and saw the car had left. She found out later he had only pulled over to make a phone call, and she shared her story with the wife of the chaplain, and now he is acutely aware of how his actions affect others and how they are perceived. In time of war, nobody ever wants to see a chaplain come to their home. And one of those many eerie examples of coincidence, the story I'm about to share with you, I had written before I read Doug's. Our youngest son, Ryan, was deployed to Afghanistan, as you know. And as a Marine, he was going to be in harm's way because he's a grunt, an infantryman. And we were able to maintain regular contact with him via the internet, so we could at least see that he was still alive every day. We could see if he had been on Facebook and posted an email. And then I saw on the internet via news that several Marines had been killed in Afghanistan in the south, which is where he was. And we didn't see anything on the internet to show he was now checking his Facebook or sending out emails. And this went on for a couple of days. And as any parent might, you start to worry. And I began to become more and more worried that perhaps Ryan was one of those who had been killed. And one day I was home alone, and I heard the dog start barking, and I heard a door slam in our driveway. Now, it is very, very unusual, almost unheard of, for someone to drive up into our driveway and visit unannounced. If someone's coming over, they generally call in advance, and we expect it. So I heard this door slam, and I knew what was coming. Fortunately, it was just the utility guy, and I don't know why he was in our driveway other than he was looking at a meter for some reason. Normally they don't come and park in your driveway, but my heart had been in my throat, and I had wondered briefly what I was going to do now. This is very similar to the experience I had in Camp Phoenix when I was sure I was going to die. I've done a different talk on that, and I won't give that again. So, war is painful in many ways. It touches lives in many ways. It leaves many people harmed, ruined, wounded, dead, destroyed, half of what they used to be. But we keep doing it over and over again. Last night, as I was trying to figure out how to finish up this sermon, I saw an article about the conflict going on now in the Ukraine. Speaking in Kiev, John McCain called Saturday for the United States to provide long-term military assistance to Ukraine, saying it is the right and decent thing to do. As reports surface, the Russian troops have traveled further north from Ukraine, into Ukraine from Crimea. McCain also had strong words for President Obama in an op-ed appearing in the New York Times. He called for the president to take actions to restore the U.S. credibility and strength around the world. Crimea has exposed the disturbing lack of realism that has characterized our foreign policy under President Obama. It is this worldview or lack of one that must change, wrote McCain. Obama's administration, McCain wrote, supports the perception that the U.S. can pull back from the world at little cost to our interests and values. This has fed a perception that the U.S. is weak, and people like Mr. Putin, to them, weakness is provocative. For McCain, this is embodied by scaled-back missile defense program and defense budgets illustrating hope, not strategy. The drumbeat for war goes on. So why do a talk about war? What possible uplifting message would come out of all this? Do I seriously think we will ever eliminate war? Will humans ever evolve beyond our violent tendencies? One can hope, but I'd say it's a small hope. War envelops and infuses every aspect of our lives, certainly in America. Our national anthem, for instance, is set during the War of 1812. Or consider this song, famous, well known. I'm sure you've all heard it, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, coming from the Civil War, which intermingles religion, God, and war so that they all become one. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fearful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. These are military camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and damps. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His day is marching on. And then I won't read it all, but in the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make him holy, let us die to make men free while God is marching on. It all merges together, God, war, and our righteous cause. The symbolism also is in the New Testament. Ephesians talks about the individual Christian wearing the armor of God. Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers and authorities, the powers of the dark world, and spiritual forces of evil. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, that when the day of evil comes, you can take your stand. You put on the belt of truth buckled about your waist, the breastplate of righteousness, your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to this, take up the shield of faith, which you can extinguish all flaming evils, arrows of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. The military symbolism permeates everything in our lives. Sports, movies, TV, religion, games, just about everything. What could possibly cause all this to change? When all people view all other people as worthy of respect, not merely competition or numbers on a scale of cost-benefit analysis, then there might be hope. When we decide that the death of the innocents is too high a price to pay for military success, there might be hope. When tyrants are no longer given the reins of power, there might be hope. But I don't think those days are right around the corner. Consider this phrase that you undoubtedly heard growing up. I know I did. Violence never solved anything. Well, the problem is that's not true. Violence does solve things, or at least it can solve a desired or achieve a desired result. For instance, you may have heard these stories. It's shown up many times in various shows, novels. A bully is picking on another kid, and that kid has to learn how to fight back. Then eventually that kid does indeed punch the bully in the face or in the gut, and the bully goes running off like a coward and leaves that child alone because the child has learned to fight back. Of course, we never learn what happens later when perhaps the bully simply goes and picks on somebody else. The violence achieved a result. It didn't solve the overall problem. It may have helped that one child to live free of terror, but the terror will go on in some other way. It certainly doesn't look at what happened to the bully to make the bully a bully, what may have happened at home, the abuse that child may have endured. But you look at the single problem and you deal with it with violence, and sometimes it does work. It certainly worked in the forming of the United States of America. We used violence to take all the land we wanted from the people who lived here. Time and time again, we justified it in the name of manifest destiny, to bring the gospel to the savages because we can use the land better. Whatever the justification was, we used violence. And we are now 50 states, the most powerful nation in the world militarily, and we did that through violence. Violence does achieve results. In World War II, perhaps one of the few wars that I think were morally justified, if there is such a thing, violence won the war. But at what cost? At how many civilian deaths? But there is no Nazi Germany today. There is no Empire of Japan today. The result was achieved. Violence does solve things, some things. And therefore, violence has an allure. In the case of the drone strikes I talked about, the results are achieved. Some people targeted are killed. But then perhaps we are creating more Al-Qaeda members, more terrorists, whatever you want to call them, than we are killing. Perhaps our narrow vision on what we are achieving blinds us to the greater end result, which is actually contrary to what we would desire. But the temptation to use force, especially at the national level, seems that it will always be with us. We hear it in politics. We hear it in what John McCain was talking about, and it's not just John McCain, and it's not just Republicans. How much strength you want to show to the world is a political issue, and neither party wants to be seen as weak. And thus, our military must be the most powerful in the world, and we must be willing to use force. So what should we do? This has been a bit negative, but then it's hard to make war a positive thing. But there are some things I think we can do, some things we can apply to our personal lives, some things that are terribly, terribly important. And while you may not walk out of here with a spring to your step because Doug's been so terribly depressing today, these are things that matter, and we can't always be puppy dogs and rainbows because people are being harmed, people are coming home from the wars harmed, and we need to be fully aware of this and deal with it. First of all, we need to avoid being duped individually and collectively. Patriotism appeals to a national interest, perhaps a religious fervor, and these appeals are used throughout history to mobilize the population for war. Even the troops become pawns in this battle. You've heard the phrase, support the troops. If you are against the war in Afghanistan or Iraq, you are not supporting the troops. You are essentially a traitor. You don't care about those poor people in the military because you think they shouldn't be over there fighting. And if you pause to think about what I just said, you realize how ridiculous it is, because if you cared about the troops, the last thing you would want them to have to be doing is fighting in a war that shouldn't be fought to begin with. And yet, that phrase, you must support the troops, becomes the rallying cry to keep fighting. And it shouldn't be used that way, and the troops should not be used as pawns to continue a war. And we must be wise enough to see through the propaganda and to stand up to it and not be allowed, or not allow people to use that sort of language to attack the peacemakers, to attack those who take a stand. The war in Iraq, as we now know in hindsight, was based entirely on either mistakes or outright deceptions on what was going on in Iraq at the time. And yet, how many of our Congress people, how many of our senators stood up against it? Almost none. We must have the moral courage to see through the propaganda and speak out when we see a wrong. Second, we must examine ourselves. We must see within our own souls how easily we can resort to violence. If not physical violence, verbal violence, or psychological violence. It is so easy to strike out. So easy. And we must strive within ourselves to avoid this easy path of violence of any sort. And it requires continual diligence, because we all trip up over it. I know I do. And we must be honest with ourselves when we exhibit it and realize this is not the way to go. Third, we must understand that those who have been to war come back different people. You cannot go over and fight time and time again and kill and have people try to kill you and see your friends killed and not come back massively changed. It's ridiculous to assume that people can come back and just fit right back into normal, whatever normal is, life after a week or 2 or 3 or even half a year. Some people can never totally adapt and come back. I'm fortunate I didn't see a lot of the trauma and have a lot of the trauma happen to me that so many others have. And my heart goes out to them. We should be demanding that our government help these people instead of the ridiculous, comical backlogs we see in the VA administration, where people's assistance is being delayed for years on end. And meanwhile, they try to paste their lives back together. It's criminal, it's obscene, and it seems like nothing's being done. Our endless wars have left a trail of destroyed lives, and we should not stand for that. Finally, we must never lose the vision of a better future, like the reading we did today. Perhaps one day there will be a time when there will be no more war, and the weapons will be turned into implements of farming, implements of peace. I know I've painted a grim picture today because the reality of war is grim, and I apologize if it's been too much. I hope it hasn't. I hope it's made you think. Because there are also signs of hope. We no longer live under the threat of nuclear war. We really don't. I remember growing up wondering if the nukes were going to fly day after day. My father, when he served in the Air Force, did something called sitting alert, which meant pilots, navigators, crew of airplanes actually lived on the base in a special facility right near the runway. So if we had to launch our airplanes, they would have a very rapid response. They could get into those planes within minutes and launch. They were doing this to go drop nukes on the Soviet Union. That was the purpose of sitting alert. When I came into the military, they got rid of that within 1 year, and no more planes sat alert. We've reduced the size of our nuclear weapons arsenals, and we don't really worry right now that the Russians are going to launch nuclear weapons at us. At least I don't. And I don't think too many people do anymore. The threat of that happening has changed dramatically. And even with the crisis going on in the Crimea right now, we're not really worried that a nuclear war is going to break out. So some things have changed for the better. But that doesn't mean that everything's gotten better, of course. So this vision for a better world, this vision for peace, starts with individuals. It has to start with us. We must cultivate it, or we will never see it grow. It begins on the individual level, and then it has to spread outwards. Now, do I have the secret on how to do that, or any kind of timeline and when that's going to happen? No, I don't. But I do know this. If we don't do it, if I don't do it, it's not going to get done. Each one of us must do what we can to try to achieve a more peaceful world, to stand for the victims of war, to try to find a better way, and to not allow our society to be bulldozed by politics and blind patriotism, but rather to stand up and say, wait, count the cost, understand what's at stake here, besides our status in the world, understand how many lives will be destroyed. We must do that, and we must help others to do that if there's to be any hope for change, and I do hope change. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to our discussion. And again, I apologize if it was a little too grim, but I felt it necessary.